Krishna, dear devotees. Welcome back again to our continued series on the glories of Sri Vrindavan Dham here on a very chilly morning in North India. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pashtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschata Deshatarane. So, today I have the honor, the great honor, to speak about the life and teachings of Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur. That's the subject that I've chosen today. You may remember that a month or two ago, we lectured on the life of Srila Narayan Bhatta Goswami, because he's been so instrumental in helping us to understand Sri Vrindavan Dham with his book, Braja Bhakti Vilas, which I often quote at the beginning of our talks. And you may have noted that we also often refer to Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur in our lectures. And rightfully so. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur said of this great devotee, and I quote, Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur was the protector, guardian, and acaraya during the middle period, 1600s to the 1700s, of the historical development of Gaudiya Vaisnavism. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur also composed a beautiful prayer in glorification of Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur. And that is, Vishvasya Nato Rupo Sho Bhakti Vartma Padarshanat Bhakta Chakre Varti Tat Vat Chakvart Yak Yaya Bhavat. Quote, because he has shown the Vishvavasis, the residents of the universe, the path of bhakti, he is called Visvanath. And because he is situated amongst the chakra, circle of devotees, he is called Chakravarti. So, Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur. It's said that in Krishna's eternal pastimes in Goloka Vrindavan, Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur is Sri Radha's maidservant, Vinod Manjari, or Vinod Valari Manjari. And amongst Gaudiya Vaisnavas, he's affectionately known as the Crest Jewel of all Vaisnavas, namely because of his, his pure devotion, his scholarship, and his realized understanding of Radha and Krishna's loving pastimes, especially for those reasons. The Crest Jewel of all Vaisnavas. And advanced devotees say that Cakravarti Thakur, as he's sometimes affectionately addressed, was especially empowered by Srila Rupa Goswami to elucidate and expand upon Sri Rupa's teachings, as well as to explain things that Srila Rupa Goswami had not elaborated on. And I was reading that he wrote over 40 Sanskrit books on the science of Krishna consciousness, and his writings include extensive commentaries on Srimad Bhagavatam and Bhagavad-gita, as well as the works of Srila Rupa Goswami, Kavi Karnapura, and Srila Narottam Das Thakur. And we know that our own beloved Srila Prabhupada, he favored Cakravarti Thakur's Bhagavatam commentaries while compiling his own purports on Srimad Bhagavatam. And Cakravarti Thakur's works also include the famous Sri Krishna Bhavanamrita, Madhurya Kandambini, Brajariti Chintamani, Chamatkara Chandrika, Swapna Vilas Amrita, and Sankalpa Kalpadruma, and others. Actually, there's a saying, I researched and I found there's a saying amongst Gaudiya Vaisnavas, Kirana Bindukana 18 Niye Vaishnava Prana. 3 books, Ujvala Nilamani Kirana, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu Bindu, and Bhagavatamrita Kana are taken and used by the Vaisnavas as their very life and soul. So all these books are by Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur. And they're taken and used by the Vaisnavas as their very life and soul. So he's such an important personality in our Guru Parampara. And because we quote him all the time, I just really wanted to glorify him today and appreciate everything that he's given to us. Scholars suspect that unfortunately many of his writings have been lost. And that's really painful to hear. I remember a disciple of Srila Govinda Maharaj, some years ago, of course. He had a copy of a very, very old scripture compiled by Srila Sridhar Swami. It was an original, actually written by Srila Sridhar Swami. He's the original commentator on Srimad Bhagavatam. This was like a precious jewel. Somehow he came into possession of that book. And but unfortunately, when that disciple of Gaur Govinda Maharaj was moving from one house to another, one day that manuscript was lost. And I remember that when Srila Gaur Govinda Maharaj was informed of this, that this valuable scripture was lost, he actually locked himself in his room and he cried for 3 days straight. That made a huge impression on me. This very valuable scripture, there was only one copy. And that disciple had it, but he lost it. So Gaur Govinda Maharaj cried for 3 days. So it's said about Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur that once Krishna appeared to him in a dream and ordered him to make commentaries on the books of the 6 Goswamis. And it was at that point that he started writing prolifically. And eyewitnesses said at that time that whenever he would sit down to write, often these acharyas, they would write outside. They lived in the dham, so they'd write under a tree, for example, in Vrindavan. Whenever he would sit down to write, clouds would appear to shield him from the sun. And whenever it rained, even during the monsoon season, miraculously not a drop of water would ever touch him or his manuscript. Can you imagine? He's outside writing in the sun and the clouds come and cover over him the whole time. And whenever he was writing and it rained, it would be raining everywhere, but not a drop would touch him or the manuscript that he was writing on. And also when he was residing in Vrindavan, he would often sit beside a particular pilu bush, while writing his books. And devotees would sometimes see him discussing Radha and Krishna's pastimes with the bush. This is Braj. Devotees would see him discussing Radha and Krishna's pastimes with the bush. Everything in Vrindavan is personal. Such a great devotee. So Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur appeared in the year 1638 in Bengal, in the district of Radhadesh, in the village of Nadia, actually just as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu did. And he was born to a very stalwart scholar and Vaishnava devotee. His father's name was Narayan Chakravarti. And Narayan Chakravarti had 3 sons, Rambhadra Chakravarti, Raghunath Chakravarti, and our Vishwanath Chakravarti. He was the youngest. And I was reading as a child, Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur was not interested in playing as normal children do. He would just spend his time hearing the Srimad Bhagavatam from his elder brothers. It was a very stalwart Vaishnava family. He just liked sitting with his brothers, Rambhadra and Raghunath, discussing Bhagavatam. And even as a child, he had very strong sadhan. It said that even at the age of 4, he was chanting the holy names of Sri Krishna thousands of times daily. Do any of you have a 4-year-old? So at 4, he was chanting thousands of names of Krishna daily. And people were astonished to see him chanting. And he was a Shruti Dhara, like our beloved Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur. Visvanatha was a Shruti Dhara. It means that he could grasp, retain, and repeat anything he heard even one time. He would read something at a young age and he would never forget it. Shruti Dhara. In fact, I came across an amazing story, or you could say pastime, of his scholarly nature as a child, as follows. One time a Digvijay Pandit came to Nadia. A Digvijay Pandit means someone who has debated with and defeated the best of all scholars in all directions. These Digvijay Pandits, they would travel and they were always engaged in different debates with other scholars. So Digvijay means that he defeated all the other scholars in all directions. And this Digvijay came to Nadia, and although Visvanatha was only 7 years old, he shocked everyone by challenging this scholar to a debate at 7. And in the debate, Visvanatha defeated the Digvijay. And the Digvijay was particularly upset because he'd been crushed by a child. He was no longer Digvijay. So afterwards, this personality was sitting alone and he was very depressed and very dejected, and he was praying to Mother Saraswati to reveal to him how it was possible that he was defeated by a 7-year-old boy. When the elder brother of Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur, as we've mentioned, Rambhadra Chakravarti, came up to this scholar and he said, "Don't lament, sir. Visvanatha is an eternal associate of Krishna. That's why he's the scholar that he is. Anyone who challenges him will be defeated, so don't mind." Hare Krishna. So, after a number of years, Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur completed his studies of Srimad Bhagavatam under his elder brother, Rambhadra Chakravarti. He was studying under his elder brother. And shortly afterwards, Rambhadra Chakravarti, his elder brother, asked him, "So Viswanath, what is the conclusion of all you've read in the Bhagavatam?" So Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur, he wasn't sure what to say. He hesitated a little bit. So Rambhadra Chakravarti instructed him to study the entire Srimad Bhagavatam, all 12 cantos, again. So he did. So 1 year later, after thoroughly reading Bhagavatam again, Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur, when he finished, he ran up to his brother, Rambhadra Chakravarti, and he said excitedly, "I finally understood the conclusion of all I've studied and learned." So the elder brother said, "And what is that?" So Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur said, "My conclusion is that one should live in Sri Vrindavan Dham. Sri Vrindavan Dham is the eternal abode of Sri Sri Radha and Krishna. It's the pleasure pastime place of the transcendental spiritual abode of the divine couple Radha and Krishna. So I'm leaving home now to serve them, the divine couple, in that sacred Dham." This was his conclusion after completing Srimad Bhagavatam, to go to Vrindavan and serve Radha and Krishna. So his elder brother smiled and he said, "Yes, you have properly understood the conclusion of Srimad Bhagavatam." It's so nice to read the lives of these acaryas. We can get so much inspiration. So when Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur arrived in Vrindavan, he initially stayed in the Bhajan Kutir of Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami at Radhakund. And there he formally accepted the dress of a renunciate. And at that time he received the name Sri Hari Ballabha. It's a name by which he rarely used it actually, although he sometimes used it as a pen name, which means that he would write under that name. Yeah. So now, Visvanatha lived in various places around Vrindavan, sometimes at Radhakund, sometimes at Yavat, sometimes at Govardhan, and sometimes in the Radhagokulananda temple. Because remember, this is some time after Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, 150 years actually, after Mahaprabhu and the Goswamis had been living. So these temples were established. So he would stay sometimes in the Radhagokulananda temple. And all these places are confirmed. He makes statements in his books that he was, doing bhajan in these various sacred places. And while staying at the Radhagokulananda temple, he worshipped the deities of Radhagokulananda, as well as the Govardhan Shila that was first worshipped by Lord Chaitanya. He worshipped that Shila of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. That very famous Govardhan Shila, we all know the history, came to him in a succession of a number of great devotees. Of course, again, it was that Govardhan Shila was given to Lord Chaitanya when he was in Jagannath Puri by a Brahmana named Shankarananda Das, who had just returned from a pilgrimage in Vrindavan. And he brought that as a present to Lord Chaitanya. That's how Lord Chaitanya got that Govardhan Shila. And then, of course, we know that Lord Chaitanya, he gave that Govardhan Shila eventually to Raghunath Das Goswami. That whole Leela is there in Chaitanya Charitamrita. And Raghunath Das Goswami, later in his life, he gave that Govardhan Shila, which has the thumbprint of Lord Chaitanya in it. It's small, rectangular shaped. He gave it to Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, the author of Chaitanya Charitamrita. And Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, he later gave that Shila to a very close friend named Sri Mukunda Das. And Mukunda Das, in turn, he gave that famous Govardhan Shila to Krishna Priya Thakurani. Krishna Priya Thakurani, a very saintly Vaishnavi who lived at Radhakund. Actually, she was the daughter of Ganga Narayan Chakravarti, a foremost disciple of Srila Narottam Das Thakur. So she's a very special person. And it's especially interesting how Krishna Priya Thakurani got the Shila from Mukunda Das. So while living at Radhakund, this saintly person, Mukunda Das, he developed a very serious stomach disorder, and he wasn't able to eat anything. Actually, at one point he was on the verge of death. So seeing this, Krishna Priya Thakurani, she saw this as an opportunity to serve a Vaishnava. And she took compassion on him. So over time she prepared special medicines for Mukunda Das out of herbs, and she was a good cook. She cooked healthy foodstuffs for him. And after a while he was completely cured. And in gratitude for saving his life, he gave her the Govardhan Shila. He gave Krishna Priya Thakurani the Govardhan Shila. And after some time, Krishna Priya Thakurani, being pleased with the scholarly endeavors and the devotional sentiments of our Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur, she presented him the Govardhan Shila. So that famous Govardhan Shila resides, now we all know, in the Radhagokulananda temple, in Vrindavan. Although some claim the Shila is in the Bhagavat Nivas ashram in Ramanreti, which is actually very close to our ISKCON Krishna Balaram Mandir. Some scholars say that. I've actually been there and taken darshan of that Shila, a Govardhan Shila in Bhagavat Nivas. Anyway, so again, Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur was living in Vrindavan about 150 years after Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's departure. Now, unfortunately, during that time, various deviations had sprung up in the name of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. People were saying that we're Gaudiyas, but they were deviating in philosophical and sensual ways. We won't go into much details. It's not very pleasant. But Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur fought vigorously against them. He would debate with them and he would write about them, and to make it very clear to the public what is really Gaudiya Vaishnavism. So on one occasion, Cakravarti Thakur, we'll use that affectionate name again, he had a public debate with some scholars who would not accept that Krishna's loving relationships with the gopis was the highest expression of divine love. They were saying something derogatory. We won't mention that, but there was a debate. And he was defending that Krishna's loving relationships with the gopis was the highest expression of divine love on the transcendental platform. And he quoted various Vaishnava scriptures, especially Srimad Bhagavatam, and he defeated all their arguments in public. So unfortunately, several of his defeated opponents took their defeat very personally. And they actually took a vow to kill Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur. So one day these very evil men, armed with knives, they waited for Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur at a place that he would pass when he was regularly doing parikrama. He would do parikrama of various holy places, so people knew where he went. So they were waiting for him on the parikrama path. And, he would come by at the same time every day. So these evil men, they're waiting, but instead of Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur passing by at this particular time, they saw a very charming young girl walk by. She was picking flowers along the way. So the rascals said, Lali, did you see Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur along the way? So the young girl, very pretty young girl, she replied, yes, I saw him earlier, but he seems to have disappeared. So it's described that, while she was speaking, she emanated a sublime radiance that distracted these men from their mission. So one of them asked her, by the way, whose daughter are you, young girl, and where do you live? So this young girl answered, oh, I am Sri Radha's maidservant. And our beautiful Radharani is now at her in-laws' house in Yavat. She sent me to pick flowers for Krishna. So as soon as she had spoken these divine words, poof, she disappeared. And in her place, standing there, was Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur. And it said that the influence of Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur's personal presence there, in both his siddha, or his eternal form as a young girl in Goloka Vrindavan, and in his sadhaka form as Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur, transformed those evil men's hearts. And they fell at his feet and begged for forgiveness. They were fortunate to see his eternal form as a gopi and to see his form as he was preaching in this world. So they got double mercy. So their hearts transformed. This is the effect of associating with the great Vaishnava, that even the most fallen people's hearts can be transformed. There's different variations of that pastime, but this is, through my readings, I found that this is what most Vaishnava scholars, they say this is what happened. So, amongst the many works that Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur composed while living in Vrindavan, one is called Mantra Rita Dipika. Mantra Rita Dipika. And this is a commentary he wrote on the sacred Kama Gayatri mantra that devotees who are brahmanas chant. It's the seventh, the last mantra that we chant in Gayatri. So he composed a whole work, a whole book on that Kama Gayatri mantra. And in his Mantra Rita Dipika, Cakravarti Thakur, he writes about that mantra, Gayatri sa maha mantra kamapur varta kat yate sadaka yam karhit vaiva jayate brajamandale. Jayate brajamandale. Quote, the Kama Gayatri is a great mantra. He says Maha Mantra, Gayatri sa Maha Mantra. The Kama Gayatri is a great mantra. Those devotees who chant it will be born in the region of Vrindavan. Now, I'd never read that before, but I was overjoyed to read that because I'm chanting that Gayatri mantra every day. So again, he writes, the Kama Gayatri is a great mantra. Those devotees who chant it will be born in the region of Vrindavan. Now, while he was researching about the Kama Gayatri, our Cakravarti Thakur, he came across a statement by Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita that perplexed him. And that's the verse in Madhya Lila, chapter 21, text 25. And that verse says about the Kama Gayatri mantra. Kama Gayatri mantra urupa haya krishnara shwarupa sarda kabisha akshara tara haya sa akshara chandra haya krishna kari udaya tri jagat kaila kama maya. That, quote, Krishna is identical with the Kama Gayatri hymn, or mantra, which is composed of 24.5 syllables that are comparable to moons that arise in Krishna and fill the three worlds with desire. Now, the interesting thing is that in every other scripture that Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur had consulted in order to write his book, it was said that the Kama Gayatri has 25 syllables. Kama Gayatri is composed of 25 syllables. So he couldn't figure out why Krishna Kaviraj Goswami had written that there are 24.5 syllables in the Gayatri mantra. Now he's an acharya. He's a great scholar. He's a great devotee. He wants to make sure that everything's presented very pakka, very properly for future generations. So this was a dilemma for him. So many shastras. Kama Gayatri is 25 syllables, but Krishnadas Kaviraj, of course, whom he had so much respect for because he's in that line, he says, in Chaitanya Charitamrita, 24.5 syllables compose the Kama Gayatri mantra. So he was, Cakravarti Thakur was reflecting on this from many angles. He's a great scholar. His mind is very deep, trying to find a satisfying explanation. Why did Kaviraj Goswami say 24.5? So, but after some time, he was unable to come to any conclusion. He couldn't figure it out. So, it's written, he decided to fast until death. Now that might sound radical to aspiring devotee, but to a pure devotee of the Lord, it was the only conclusion. Because we see, we can understand that in the mind of Cakravarti Thakur, because it's described as he sat on the banks of Radhakund one day, he was thinking, if one cannot understand the syllables of the mantra, how can one know the Lord? And if one cannot know the Lord, why should one continue to live? This was his thinking. If one cannot understand the syllables of the mantra, how can one know the Lord? And if one cannot know the Lord, why should one continue to live? So it's described that he continued to lament his plight on the banks of Radhakund well after midnight. And when he finally fell asleep, Srimati Radharani appeared to him in a dream. And she compassionately said, and I'm quoting, she addressed him by that name that he received at Radhakund. Just a sec, it's getting cold here in the room. In the dream she said, "Oh Hari Bhalabha, get up. That which Krishnadas Kaviraj has written is true. Like you, he is also my confidential maidservant. By my mercy, he knows everything about my secret, innermost moods. Please give up your grief. This mantra is for worshipping me, and by its syllables I can be known. But without my mercy, no one can understand the mystery of myself or the mantra." So in the dream, Radharani then told Vishwanath that the question of how Kama Gayatri is actually 24 and a half syllables could be found in a book called Varna Gama Bhashvat, which reveals a rare grammatical rule that explains how there are only 24 and a half syllables in the Kama Gayatri and not 25. So she said, when you wake up, you find that book and it will explain everything to you. So after waking up, Cakravarti Thakur, he went searching for that book, Varnagama Bhashvati. And Bhashvat. And when he found a copy and read it, his mind became peaceful, reading the proper explanation. And it's a very rare grammatical rule. So I was reading. It's a little complicated. I won't go into it here, but it explained everything to Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur. He became peaceful, and with this revelation, he was able to complete his own book, Mantra Riti Dipika, about the Kama Gayatri mantra. So I thought that was a very interesting pastime. Now when Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur grew old, he actually retired from active preaching and even writing. And he was basically just in samadhi, deeply absorbed in thoughts of Vrindavan and Radha and Krishna. He'd done his work, so he was, the final years, he was in samadhi. I also read that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur, at the end of his life, he retired for 3 years in samadhi, simply focusing on chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, and relishing the pastimes of Radha and Krishna in Vrindavan and Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in Nadia in Mayapur. So now during the time that Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur was in this state of samadhi, a debate broke out in Jaipur, south of Vrindavan, at the famous Radha Govinda temple. Of course, by this time, many of the deities of Vrindavan had been transferred from Vrindavan to Jaipur for safekeeping from foreign invasions. So Radha Govinda, the deities of Srila Rupa Goswami, they were being worshipped in their temple in Jaipur. But a debate broke out. Some influential brahmanas, they were actually from the Sri Sampradaya of Ramanujacharya, they're called Ramanandis, who shared the worship of Radha Govinda with priests from the Gaudiya Vaisnava tradition. In other words, the Gaudiyas were worshipping Radha Govinda, and so were the Ramanandis. That was different groups were worshipping Radha Govinda. These Ramanandis, one day they approached the king of Jaipur. His name was Jai Singh II. And they said that they had decided that the deity of Srimati Radharani should be removed from the altar. They said it wasn't proper that she was there, and that only Govindaji should be worshipped. Now they said their reasons for taking Radharani away were because, they said, I don't even like to repeat this, but this is history. They said, oh, her name is not mentioned in Srimad Bhagavatam or the Vishnu Purana. We won't debate that now. All of us know that she is mentioned, Adadana. Secondly, her worship is not supported in Shastra. And number 3, unlike the queens of Dwarka, she never married Krishna. She never had a proper vivaha yagya samskara. They were against this parikya bhav, the unwedded mood of loving Krishna like the gopis. They couldn't understand that. So they said that, this is not right. It's not, one can worship Lakshmi Narayan because Lakshmi's the wife of Narayan, or one can worship Sita Ram because Sita's the wife of Lord Ram, but this Parakya Bhav of Radha and Krishna, it's not proper. So Radharani should go. But their main point was that the Gaudiya Vaisnavas who were worshipping her, they were not part of a bona fide sampradaya. Therefore, all the Gaudiyas should be relieved of their service as well. So, this is a big challenge in many ways, that the Gaudiya Vaisnavas are not part of a bona fide sampradaya. So, Jai Singh II asked why the Gaudiyas were not part of a bona fide sampradaya. And the Ramanandis, they said, well, they have no link to the 4 sampradayas, which are the Brahma Sampradaya, the Rudra Sampradaya, the Shri Sampradaya, and the Kumara Sampradaya. And they don't have a commentary on Vedanta Sutra. All these 4 sampradayas have commentaries on Vedanta Sutra, which itself is a summary of all Vedic knowledge. So these were their arguments. And these Ramanandis, they had a very powerful influence in Jaipur. They had many followers. But Jai Singh II, the king, he was naturally inclined to the Gaudiyas because he himself was a Gaudiya Vaishnava. Hare Krishna. So, but he's the king. And the kings, they have these duties to keep things peaceful in society. They have to engage diplomacy. So although he had his personal feelings, he had to act in such a way as the king to be diplomatic. So what he did is he proposed, let's have a debate then between the Ramanandis and the Gaudiyas to determine if the Gaudiya Vaishnavas are authentic or not. And we'll debate these things that you've brought up. So the Ramanandis agreed. This is how gentlemen solve political issues, not by war, but by debate, by philosophy. This is a better way. So now Jai Singh II, being a Gaudiya Vaishnava, he was well aware that Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur was the preeminent devotee at the time, and that he was living at Radhakund in Vrindavan. So he wanted Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur to represent the Gaudiya Vaishnavas. He wanted him to come to Jaipur to debate with these Ramanandis. So I read, because I went as deep as I could into it, he sent a carriage. He sent a carriage to Radhakund in Vrindavan with some of his representatives with a letter to Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur, begging him to come and defend Gaudiya Vaishnavism against these Ramanandi scholars. And he wrote, if you come, Viswanath, and if the Gaudiyas win, then our Radharani will stay on the altar. But if these Ramanandis win, Radharani will be taken away from her beloved Govinda. So this is a very historic moment in the history of our movement. But as we mentioned earlier, Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur was elderly at that time. He was actually, I think, in his late 60s. And he couldn't move, or it was difficult for him to move. And what's more, he was absorbed in bhajan, and he'd actually taken a vow never to leave Vrindavan. So, but he was concerned. So what did he do? He sent his foremost student to debate with the Ramanandi followers. His foremost student. And who was that person? Who was that devotee? Who was that disciple? The chosen one to go and defend Gaudiya Vaisnavism and protect Radharani? It was the great Baladeva Vidyabhusana. Just to say their names makes your heart tremble. Baladeva Vidyabhusana. Now we all know, or we should know, of Baladeva Vidyabhusana, if only because our beloved Srila Prabhupada dedicated his Bhagavad-gita As It Is, his commentary on Bhagavad-gita, Bhagavad-gita As It Is, he dedicated it to Baladeva Vidyabhusana. He writes in the very beginning of the Gita, and I quote, Prabhupada writes, to Srila Baladeva Vidyabhusana, who presented so nicely the Govinda Bhasya commentary on Vedanta philosophy. To Srila Baladeva Vidyabhusana, who presented so nicely the Govinda Bhasya commentary on Vedanta philosophy. Makes your hair stand on end. And Srila Prabhupada also told a very personal story one time about Sri Baladeva Vidyabhusana. He reminisced how he had received the order of his spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur, to preach in the English speaking language at their very first meeting. We know that history as well. Prabhupada was reminiscing like that, but he said later when he was married, he had to focus on his business to support his family, so he wasn't able to at that time fulfill that instruction of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur because he was busy. However, one day while reading Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur's own commentary on Bhagavad-gita, his purports to the Bhagavad-gita, he came across that famous verse, Bhagavad-gita 2:41. Quote, those who are on this path are resolute in purpose, and their aim is one. O beloved child of the Kurus, Krishna says, the intelligence of those who are irresolute is many-branched. So in the purport to that verse, Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur writes, Prabhupada was reading this purport, quote, being resolute in purpose means to accept one's spiritual master's desire and instruction as one's life and soul. So true. Being resolute in purpose means to accept one's spiritual master's desire and instruction as one's life and soul. Preach boldly and have faith in the holy names. Hare Krishna. So when Prabhupada read that, it had a big effect on him. And he immediately, although he was a householder and he had the business, he immediately began making plans for following that original instruction of his spiritual master to spread Krishna consciousness in the English-speaking medium. Began preaching. So Prabhupada felt that Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur had a big influence on him through his writings, through his purport. As Srila Prabhupada's purports to his book should have a big influence on us as well. So, what is that quote Prabhupada said? He lives forever by his divine instructions, and the follower lives with him. Prabhupada writes that, speaking about his own spiritual master. So, anyway, it was that very Baladeva Vidyabhusana who Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur sent for the debate in Jaipur. Now, Baladeva Vidyabhusana, you could say he was the perfect person to send to Jayapur to defend our tradition. He was born, or he appeared, near the famous town of Remuna in Orissa. And after his initial schooling in Sanskrit, rhetoric and logic, it's described, he left home to visit various places of pilgrimage and, quote, to hear from saints, unquote. The scholars write like that. He left to hear from saints. Shravanam Kirtanam, Krishna Shmaranam. So eventually, Baladeva Vidyabhusana, he accepted the renounced order, and he traveled around India, and his travels brought him to Jagannath Puri for quite some time, actually. And there he was very inspired, and he took initiation from a disciple of Rasikananda Prabhu, whose name was Pandit Radha Damodar, a wonderful Vaishnava, Pandit Radha Damodar. And eventually his Diksha Guru, Pandit Radha Damodar, instructed Baladeva Vidyabhusana to travel to Vrindavan and study Srimad Bhagavatam under Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur. I thought that was interesting. His Diksha Guru sent him to a Shiksha Guru to study. And who was the Shiksha Guru he was to study Bhagavatam under? Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur. So being very pleased with Baladeva Vidyabhusana's scholarship and devotion at this point in history when the debate was meant to take place, Vishwanath felt that Baladeva was qualified to defeat the Ramanandi, they're called Ramanandavadis of Galita. They're described in one scripture. So now Baladeva Vidyabhusana's main challenge, of course, in the debate in Jaipur was to prove was going to be to prove that Gaudiya Vaisnavas are authorized being part of a bona fide sampradaya by presenting a full commentary on Vedanta Sutra. Now, like any Vedic scripture, Vedanta Sutra is very large. It's well over 500 verses, 555, I don't know exactly, but in the 500s. So he had to make a commentary on that. So he had an immense challenge ahead of him because time was short. So he traveled to Jaipur from Vrindavan, and upon arriving at the king's court, he entered into an initial, very animated debate with the scholars, but these Ramanandi scholars, but despite being impressed with Baladev's vast learning and conclusive arguments, the Ramanandis insisted that without a commentary on Vedanta Sutra, the Gaudiyas couldn't claim to be part of any bona fide disciplic succession. That was the tradition. Although Baladeva explained that Lord Chaitanya accepted the Srimad Bhagavatam as a natural commentary on Vedanta Sutra. By Srila Vyasadeva. But the scholars didn't accept that. So the Brahmanas insisted that if we're going to accept you, you have to produce a commentary on Vedanta Sutra, the Upanishads, and the Bhagavad-gita, and we give you 3 months. Some scholars say 3 weeks, some say 3 days, but the general consensus is that he had three months to do this. And but the deadline was unreasonable. It was unlikely that he would finish in time because it's a huge work to do something like that in an authorized way. So what did Baladeva Vidyabhusana do in that dilemma, like any devotee would do? He concluded that his only recourse to be able to do that in time and defend us and protect Radharani was to take shelter of the Lord himself. So what did he do? He went to the temple and he went before Govindaji, our beloved Govindaji in Jaipur. So many of us have been there. And he related all that had happened. And he prayed with the Lord to intervene. So that very night, Govindaji appeared in a dream to Baladeva Vidyabhusana. And in the dream, Govindaji said, "Do not worry, Baladev. Just write the commentary. I will guide you. By my blessing, the work will not only be completed in time, but it will be faultless." That's what the Lord said to him in the dream. "Do not worry, Baladev. Just write the commentary. I will guide you. By my blessing, the work will not only be completed in time, but it will also be faultless." So, history it's written that the next morning Baladev requested writing material and reference books from Jai Singh II. Kind of all working together here. And then he took up the commentary on Vedanta Sutra, and then the Upanishads, and finally the Bhagavad-gita. And all the while, Govindaji was guiding him from within. You could say Govindaji was guiding his pen. And at the conclusion of 3 months, Baladeva Vidyabhusana placed his writings, conclusion, before the Ramanandi Brahmanas. And they were stunned by his presentation. And they all accepted what he had written. How can one deny what the Lord dictates? And in his work, Baladev established our Gaudiya movement as part of the Brahma Sampradaya. So therefore we're known as the Brahma Madhva Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya. We could go into more detail, but we're the Brahma Madhva Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya. And as a result, King Jai Singh II granted the Vaishnavas exclusive rights to the service of Govindaji. In other words, the Ramanandis were out, with all due respect. I mean, those particular Brahmanas, they challenged that was not correct, but we have so much respect, of course, for the Sri Sampradaya, for the followers of Sri Ramanujacharya. This is just one incident there, but whatever the case, the king, he was a Gaudiya, he took advantage. So he said, now the Gaudiyas, they have exclusive rights to the service of Govindaji. And by the grace of Baladeva Vidyabhusana and Govindaji, they or we, the Gaudiyas, continue to enjoy the honor, that honor down to the present day. When you go to Jaipur and you go to the temple of Radha Govinda, so many thousands and thousands of people there. Very often, the pujaris, the priests, they'll notice ISKCON devotees and they'll invite them up next to the altar for a close darshan of Radha Govinda. Of course, others can also go, but I've noticed that many times when I'm there with a group of devotees on parikrama, the pujaris, they'll go like that and they'll come. So we get to go up and we have that special darshan. They'll give you the chandan paste from Govindaji's feet with the tulsi leaves there. They'll take a garland off Radharani and give it to you. So, all glories to Baladeva Vidyabhusana. It's said that the king was so impressed by Baladev's achievement that it was he who gave him the title Baladeva Vidyabhusana. Some scholars say that prior to that his name was Damodar Vipra. Some scholars say that, but and many scholars say that because of that achievement he achieved that name Baladeva Vidyabhusana. And it's written that when he received a hero's welcome when he returned to Vrindavan, and he was highly respected and revered until he departed this world in 1768. And Baladeva Vidyabhusana's samadhi lies in a secluded part of the Radha Shyamasundar temple compound in Vrindavan. So please, when you go to Vrindavan next time, and we often, isn't it, we go to Radhashrama Sundar, it's one of the principal temples in Vrindavan. In a secluded part, you can ask the pujaris, but go there and pay full dandavats to this great devotee. So as Srila Prabhupada expressed his gratitude for this, his presentation is called Govinda Bhasya. That was the name of the presentation that he gave to the Ramanandis to establish as a bona fide sampradaya and keep Radharani on the altar. Govinda Bhasya. It could have been called, Baladeva Bhasya, but he wanted to call it Govinda Bhasya because it was written by Govindaji. So as Prabhupada expressed his gratitude to Baladeva Vidyabhusana in his Bhagavad-gita As It Is, referring to his Govinda Bhasya, we too must thank Baladeva Vidyabhusana for taking up the challenge to fight for Krishna, so to speak. In that regard, I was thinking that we must never take all that we have now in Krishna consciousness for granted. We have so much. We should always remember that all our previous acharyas and their followers, they often struggled in so many ways to give us the good fortunes that we enjoy today. The holy names, our scriptures, our deities, our temples, the very food we eat. Really, it's all come as a result of great sacrifice. We're all aware of the sacrifice of our beloved Srila Prabhupada, but we also know that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur, his life was threatened. Bhaktivinoda Thakur to reestablish, to pioneer the Krishna consciousness movement, and now we're hearing about Baladev, and there's centuries and centuries of devotees who have worked for ISKCON to be what it is today. I was reading the other day how Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he wanted to get a copy of the Chaitanya Charitamrita. It took him years to actually find an authorized copy of Chaitanya Charitamrita. Yes, this is history. It took him years to find. And we have it sitting on our shelf. Are we reading it? Are we scrutinizingly reading it? Are we embracing it within our heart and then giving it to others? He couldn't find it for years. So all these things that we have, everything's been handed to us on a golden platter, you could say. We have everything. Many of these devotees in previous generations, they didn't have access to. So we should never take for granted the books sitting on our shelf, the beads in our bead bag, everything that we have. It's all come as a result of a great sacrifice by so many devotees over centuries, really. And in honor of them, we should take advantage. We should read the books we have, we should chant attentively, we should worship our deities with love. When we sit down to take prasadam, we shouldn't eat prasadam, we should respect prasadam. I remember on several occasions seeing Srila Prabhupada take prasadam. He was eating very slowly. He liked to eat generally alone, because I think in that atmosphere he could actually he would take very carefully. I was watching one time in New Mayapur, he was taking prasadam very carefully. So we should respect. We're just so blessed. And when we hear of the heroic efforts of previous acharyas like Baladeva Vidyabhusana and Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur and others, we should be eager to step forward and do our part as well. We should be grateful for what we have, and we should step forward and do what we can as individuals to, you could say, keep the flame burning. Hare Krishna. So, Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur, he kept writing. He kept writing in Vrindavan. But as he grew older, he became more and more renounced, withdrawn from this world, and eager to return to Goloka Vrindavan. This is the test of Krishna consciousness. Although he needed no test, I'm just saying that the proof that we're making advancement in Krishna consciousness is that we're becoming more renounced. It takes time, but we're becoming more renounced, and that our heartbeat is to go back home, back to Vrindavan. So in the final stage of his life, Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur, he was, he was commenting on the last verses of the Bhagavad-gita commentary in the 18th chapter. But what happened is there was a rat one night who came and ate his commentary on those last verses of the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad-gita. And he never wrote those commentaries again. Those last verses of the 18th chapter, he never completed them. They're missing in his commentary, if you see. And when he was asked why, he didn't rewrite those commentaries, which the rat had eaten one night. He said, and I quote, "Lord Ganesh doesn't want me to write commentary to those verses. Therefore his Vahan, or you say his representative, the rat, came and ate all of that away." Like that. Lord Ganesh doesn't want me to write my commentaries on those verses. Therefore his Vahan, his representative, came and ate all of that away. So most likely anyone else would write it again, thinking that, well, the rat came, but he spoiled all my work, so I'm going to write it. But Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur, he took it all somehow or other as a plan of the Lord. And this is how pure devotees think. This is how they see Krishna everywhere and Krishna in everything. And sometimes it's said that one cannot understand the mind of a great Vaishnava, but that's how he took it. So when Srila Visvanatha, and if you see that his commentary in Bhagavad Gita, those verses are missing at the end, so now you know why. So when Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur left this world in 1708, he was about 70 years old. And his body was placed in samadhi at Vishwanath Kunj, it's called now, near the Yogapith, which is another place where he had performed bhajan. But in 1951, I don't know why, but there was probably a good reason. In 1951, his sacred samadhi was moved to the compound at Radha Gokulananda Temple, beside the Pushpa Samadhis of Srila Narottam Das Thakur and Ganganarayan Chakravarti. And of course there we know is the full Samadhi of Srila Lokanath Goswami. And for sure, Prabhus, there we will go on our next parikrama, all together. And, I'm sorry, excuse me. There will we place our heads at the feet of Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur and all those saints. And we will pray like Baladeva Vidyabhusana prayed to Radha Govinda to be somehow useful in their service within our own lifetimes, and never ever, even for a moment, forget the sacrifices that they all made for us and the wonderful blessings they left behind for each and every devotee in our movement, past, present, and future. And if we do that, then we know this movement will go on, ensuring the world of good fortune. And that way we'll honor those devotees. So, in that light, I would like to finish today with some words from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur in that same mood. So, here we go. The religion practiced by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is universal and not exclusive. The principle of kirtan, congregational chanting of the holy names of God, is the future church of the world, and it invites all classes of men, without distinction of caste or clan, to the highest cultivation of the spirit. This church, it appears, will extend all over the world and take the place of all sectarian churches, which exclude outsiders from the precincts of the mosque, church, or temple. Lord Chaitanya did not advent himself to liberate only a few men of India. Rather, his main objective was to emancipate all living entities of all countries throughout the entire universe and preach the eternal religion. Lord Chaitanya says in the Chaitanya Bhagavat, quote, "In every town, country, and village, my name will be sung," unquote. There is no doubt that this unquestionable order will come to pass. Although there is still no pure society of Vaisnavas, devotees of Krishna, to be had, this was written many years ago, of course, yet Lord Chaitanya's prophetic words will in a few days come true. I am sure. Why not? Nothing is absolutely pure in the beginning. From imperfection, purity will come about. Oh, for that day when the fortunate English, French, Russian, German, and American people will take up banners, mridangas, drums and kartal cymbals, and raise kirtan through the streets and towns. When, oh, when will that day come? When will that day come? Well, we can say to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur, excuse me, I'm sorry, that day has come by the grace of his illustrious son, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur, and by the grace of his chosen spiritual son, our beloved Srila Prabhupada, who made such a sacrifice to come at an old age to the West, armed only with a few books, the holy names of Krishna, and full faith in the instructions of his spiritual master. It's all come to pass. And now it's happening all over the world by their grace. And again, Prabhus, we're the recipients, and we must keep the mission going. If necessary, we must also undergo some austerities and some penances and some sacrifice to keep it going. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur said one time to the Lord, difficulties encountered in your service, they're my greatest pleasure. So let us keep in mind all these great personalities that we've discussed today, Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur, Baladeva Vidyabhusana, even Jai Singh II, Gaudiya King in Jaipur, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Gorkhashwardas Babaji, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur, our beloved Srila Prabhupada, and all of you, great souls who are continuing this wonderful mission of Krishna consciousness. So, thank you very much. Shri Shri Gauranitai ki, Shri Shri Krishna Balaram ki, Shri Shri Radha Shama Sundar ki, Vrindavaneshwari Srimati Radharani ki, Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur ki, Baladeva Vidyabhusana ki, all our Vaishnavacharyas ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, all devotees of the International Society of Krishna Consciousness ki, all Vaishnavas in the world ki, back home, back to Godhead, Shri Goloka Vrindavan Dham ki, and take all the fallen conditioned souls, every single one of them, back to Srila Prabhupada's lotus feet in Goloka Vrindavan Dham ki. Jai Jai Sisi Radhe Sharm. Thank you. Hare Krishna. See you in a few days.